This is the editing room of a scholar, a professor of philosophy. His name is Huston Smith. For 6 months, Dr. Smith has been doing research on a special project and recording his findings on film. His purpose has been more than usually serious and profound. He's made an attempt to discover America's own moral answers to 16 of the most basic public and private issues that Americans face. In his search, Dr. Smith has traveled thousands of miles and asked literally hundreds of questions. He's talked with scholars and statesmen, newspaper editors and economists, philosophers and politicians. Tonight, from these priceless film records of that journey, Dr. Smith has drawn together what he believes are America's best answers to another basic problem of our future. Tonight on The Search for America.
I'm Huston Smith. The object of tonight's search is crime and delinquency. The question, what should be our attitude towards those who break our laws? Wherever there are cities today, there is crime and delinquency. And our migration to the cities has led to a vast upsurge in violence and deviant behavior. Here are just a few of the headlines that appeared during the time that we were actually on the road for this project. Juvenile arrests rise 9.8 in the nation. Juvenile crimes up 22% in Nassau. Delinquency found doubled in 10 years. At a time when America is hard-pressed from without, it's appalling to find the spread of this social cancer within. What's causing this vast upsurge in crime and delinquency, and what could we be doing about it? Those are the questions which face us tonight. Two symptoms have been particularly troubling. One of these has been the increase in juvenile crime. Today, over half the total crimes in our nation are committed by people under 18 years of age. The other disturbing symptom has been the increase in senseless violence, wanton destruction of property, and attacks on strangers with no motive other than the expression of hostility. To ask what lies behind these symptoms and what we might do about them, I put the question to many people, but the one whose answers made most sense to me was a man named Bertram Beck, Associate Director of the National Association of Social Workers. I found him in his barn-like office in Lower Manhattan, and I still remember the vitality with which he responded to questions that had been troubling me. Dr. Beck, the newspapers today are full of violence, day after day. Accounts of murder, and rape, and arson. Do you think that the rate of crime and delinquency is actually increasing as it seems to be?
Yes, I've contemplated that a good deal, and I've reached the conclusion that there is a real increase in the number of delinquent acts and the number of criminal acts being committed.
Is this an increase in addition to the normal population growth?
Well, it exceeds what you would expect from the normal population growth. For example, take the number of children who come before juvenile courts today. The increase is about 7 times. This is between 1950 and 1958, about 7 times the normal increase you'd expect from the fact that there are more children in the population.
What do you think explains it?
Well, if there was one single thing that I was going to name as responsible for the increase in delinquency and crime, I would use the word exclusion, or I would use the words shut out. I think that when we examine the delinquent act or the criminal act, and we ask ourselves, what is the significance of this act? What is the meaning behind it? The answer is not a complicated one. The criminal act or the delinquent act is essentially a striking out at the community, a striking out at people in authority. Now, who is it that strikes out? It is the person who doesn't belong. It's the person who's shut out. Now, this shut out can occur in many different ways. And I think one of the common ways that it occurs, a way that we're all familiar with, that's maybe been overstressed, is that you can have shut out right in the heart of the family. That is, there are a small number of youngsters who are brought up under conditions where parents, because of problems within the parents, fail to encompass that youngster in a family where there's a sense of purpose and meaning, where the youngster can feel shut out of the family. A very good example of this, and a very basic one, is what happens to an infant who is shut out of the care of a mother or a mother substitute in the very first months of life. A lot of people don't know that it's possible to take an infant during the first years of life, remove that infant from the care of a mother or a mother substitute, that is, raise the infant in an institution, and so deprive that infant of a kind of love that's a civilizing force, a training force, that that infant grows up and the rest of his life is interested in grab and get. He can't tolerate frustrations. He can't tolerate not having that which he needs, no matter how much you punish him or how much you treat him. In other words, there's a kind of a shutout that can occur in the family during the very first years of the life of the human being. But this accounts, and I'd like to emphasize this, only for a very small portion of crime and delinquency in America today.
What are some of these other kinds of exclusion?
Well, I think that exclusion by the community is very important. For example, we know that many minority groups that suffer discrimination have a higher rate of delinquency, you see, than groups of people who are not discriminated against. Now, why is this? It is because the youngsters in those groups suffer a kind of a shutout and an exclusion. Take a Negro youngster, for example, born in a community where just because of the pigmentation of his skin, he's discriminated against. Well, now, that youngster has an extra inducement to delinquency. I don't mean for any moment that most Negro children become delinquent, but I'm saying that when the community discriminates, we push youngsters toward delinquency because they are more prone to strike out at the community that rejects them. That's another kind of exclusion, you see. Then there's the shutout that occurs in the typical slum community as you have in great cities all over the face of this nation. That is, in every great city, and even in some rural communities, there are pockets of distress within the community where people who, for one reason or another, haven't been able to compete successfully in striving for material goods, live together, and these are called slums. Now, in those communities, we have many youngsters who are shut out. That is, they're shut out from the material goods, from the satisfactions that money can buy. They're living in communities where the sense of right and wrong may be different than the total community. In other words, it may be, and usually is, quite accepted for a youngster in a tough slum neighborhood who often has to really protect his very life. It is normal for him to carry the knife. It's natural for him to fight. So there's a kind of community shutout, you see, that occurs where youngsters can be delinquent. Now, the tricky problem today, because you asked me what accounts for the increase in delinquency, and I've been talking about what makes delinquency. But the tricky problem today, and the increase, I believe, and the most baffling thing, is that today we find delinquents in the suburbs or in the neighborhoods that are by no means slums.
Very different. Yeah.
Very different, yes. But different, I'm not so sure. I'll take that back. Not as different as it would seem, because I think the same factor is operating. I think what we're dealing with today is a kind of shutout that can occur in the suburbs as well as in the slums. For example, the youngster today brought up in the areas growing up around our large cities or in typical middle-class neighborhood tends to be the new to the town. That is, we have a terrific mobility amongst families today, great shifts in population, so that a youngster doesn't have the kind of stability that he would have had, let's say, 50 years ago growing up in the small town that characterized America, where his neighbors were people that had known the family for years. When he walked out in the street, everyone knew who he was and cared about him. So that he doesn't have those long, deep roots into the neighborhood that existed. Then another thing that we find in today's suburb has to do with the fact that there have been changes that have taken place in the nature of the family itself, that we may have more people working. And this means that there may not be the encompassment in the family that would occur, say, 50 years ago. Then a major factor, I believe, is, and something that many people ignore, is the impact of the draft into military service on young people growing up today. That this is something we've never had before in our national life. But today, every young man properly anticipates a period of time in military service. So that whereas some 10, 15 years ago, a young man growing up in middle-class America might well look forward to the fact that if he behaved himself, he goes to high school, he goes to college, he gets married, he raises a family, he climbs the ladder of success, that is a real inducement to behave for the middle-class youngster, or was, or the suburban youngster.
But how does this relate to the matter of belonging? If a young man is called into the service, doesn't this mean very definitely that he belongs to his country, that he's needed?
Well, in this sense, I would say in two senses. One sense, that the youngsters going into service today are not given the feeling of belonging that they should have. That our communities in America want to turn their back on the fact of military service. For example, an organization with which I work developed a curriculum, a pre-induction curriculum to be used in the high schools to help youngsters that are going into military service, and developed it because of the need for this kind of pre-induction training or knowledge. But they had a very hard time to get any community that would put this material in the high school, even though this was what the youngsters were going for, because communities didn't want to face it. So many of these youngsters feel that they are called upon to make an important sacrifice of a number of years in life without the sense of support on the part of the adults, you see, in the community. So the youngsters feel cut off and apart from the adult world, and this is a kind of an important shutout. You see, unless we can build a bridge from the adult world to the world of young people growing up, a bridge that's constructed out of a sense that the world in toto, that the community in toto is moving ahead in a manner that has meaning, unless we can build that bridge, then young people tend to form their own world with their own manner of dress and their own manner of speech, and make their shut-in, if you will, for themselves.
Let me see if I have this straight. The reason for delinquency is in exclusion, the absence of the sense of belonging. This exclusion is concentrated primarily in the industrial slums, where people are poor, the housing is bad, and the minorities live by and large. But you also find delinquency in the suburbs, and here the people are rich, the housing is good, and the people are not minorities. But the reason is that, again, the young here do not have this sense of belonging. The causes of exclusion are different, but the fact is the same.
Yes,
Is that right?
Yes, that's exactly right. In summary, we might say that it is how you feel about yourself and the world in which you live that produces delinquency.
Yeah. Let's turn now to the question of what should be done. What do you think should be done in the current situation?
There are many things that can be done to prevent crime and delinquency today, and they're not too mysterious. One could approach it on three levels. And talk about the things that could be done to prevent these symptoms of maladjustment from ever arising, the things that could be done to catch problems at their very earliest and do something about them, and then the things that could be done after a youngster is delinquent.
Well, I think I'd like to hear you say something about each one of these.
There are in our 3,000 juvenile courts in the United States of America a very, very slim number that have any probation service whatsoever. You see, trained or untrained. Of all our probation officers, less than 11% have their full professional training. Now I'm going to leave that there, but that's just one example of what could be done to help delinquents after they are delinquent. That is, to equip our juvenile courts with the kind of personnel and knowledge needed to do their job.
Well, what about these other two areas now?
Yes. Well, now an example of what we must do to find youngsters when they have problems and bring help to them. We could, if we would do something about the need for public school systems in the United States where teachers have a manageable class where we can attract teachers through decent salary, we could help our teachers to understand what are the beginning symptoms, you see, of maladjustment. We could make the teacher the first aid person, help her to deal with these problems. We could place behind her in our school systems an array of services for these youngsters, you see, so that they never get into court, they never become criminals. We could do this, but instead, of course, the situation of our schools today in communities across the country is well known. Now, just one example from the other area in which we must move. What can we do to keep problems from ever arising? Well, I think of one place that we could place a great deal of attention, and I'm thinking now of the families in America who are on public assistance or on relief. Here we have families, and we know this from studies, that are prone to have a number of different problems: delinquency, dependency, chronic illness. Our tendency is to impoverish them, to give them just as little as we can, with the idea that if we do that, no one else will want to go on relief. That's not so. If instead of impoverishing them, we had people who were trained to help those families, if we would, the first time a family becomes dependent, throw our resources in there, help that family back to independence, we could do a great deal to prevent these problems from ever arising. Those are only three examples.
How do you feel about this whole area of our national life? Do you think that the amount of violence that we have today indicates that our society is on the rocks?
No, I don't think it means that our society is on the rocks, but I think it's a danger signal that it will go on the rocks unless we create the kind of facilities, organizations, and services in our communities that can do the necessary job.
I take it we're not doing this now.
No, we are not.
Do you think that we will? Are you hopeful, or do you...
I am hopeful that we will, though I have no way, no one would have, of being certain. I feel that in every human being, in all of us, delinquents or none, there is a capacity to care for other people as well as certain destructive urges. Now, in the process of civilization, in the process of rearing one child, we attempt to gain control over those instinctual urges and substitute the civilizing capacity to care. In the development of a civilization, we attempt to build up the capacity to care for one another. What we need to do now at this stage in our history is to reach into all of our people, into all of ourselves individually, you see, and build upon the capacity to care, the capacity to love, if you will, so that we're ready to provide the support and the concern necessary to build the sort of things that will prevent delinquency and crime.
The next day, some 50 blocks uptown, I kept an appointment with another intense and remarkable person, Dr. Margaret Mead. I was sure that this world-famous anthropologist and acute observer of American life could make a real contribution to my search for answers. Her office is on the top floor of the American Museum of Natural History in New York City. Its disarray was in direct contrast to the order and precision of her mind. Are you alarmed by the statistics on delinquency and crime in our country?
Yes, I'm very much alarmed by them, but I'm alarmed by them that we are willing to condemn the number of children that we are condemning in this country to delinquency. We know in a given town just what the delinquency rate is going to be. We know in advance that so many children who are now 10 will be delinquent by the time they're 14. We have all the statistics. We know what the conditions are, and we consent to them, year after year.
Now, what do you mean we consent to them?
We don't do anything about it. We know what the conditions are.
Do we know what we should be doing about it?
I think so. We know that delinquency occurs in every large city in the world, no matter what its general setup, what the religious system, what the political system. So we know that delinquency is the result of the type of living in such aggregations that no one takes responsibility for anybody in them. I mean, all the bad areas and the interstitial areas and the areas where the newcomers live, and the areas right across the tracks from those areas today, so that delinquency is spreading into many of our protected enclaves. We know that there will be delinquency, and that we will give up, and instead of setting up the necessary instruments to protect these children, we will turn them over to the law, stigmatize them, punish them, and send them to schools of crime, called detention homes and reform schools, so they will graduate into, again, an expected segment of the population who will be criminals or failures or athletic or alcoholics. Now, all delinquent children, of course, don't become criminals, but enough do, so that it's a frightful thing for us to be doing to a segment of our children each year.
I'm somewhat startled by this phrase that we consent to do nothing about it. Do we?
Well, in any given spot, we know what to do about it. I mean, the thing we don't know how to mobilize and keep mobilized public responsibility for all the housing in the city. See, we know but will not insist on an uncorrupt police force, because the bulk of the society wants a corrupt police force. And that's sheer consent. We know what to do about that. If the bulk of good citizens wanted the kind of police force that would really enforce parking rules, we could have them right this minute. And this would an absolutely uncorruptible police force who are never exposed to request to fix a ticket is one of the things we need. We know what we could do about dope if we were willing to really run down the dope peddlers and really penalize them correctly, which we don't. See, there are a great many things that we know, but I'm willing to say that in any given spot could clear up delinquency. But it would then come in again to a degree through the mass media, through the fact that we publish every day prescriptions for crime that every child in the country can read, so they know just how to commit a murder.
Are you concerned about our comic books?
Well, I don't think the comic books are nearly as serious as the accurate reporting of what was done by real individuals.
The newspapers, then?
Newspaper, radio, television, in which you hear about real crimes committed by identified persons who might have been you. Comic books, cowboy stories, they can be allowed for as fiction.
Well, do you think that there should be censorship?
I'm afraid I don't. I think that if we had a different kind of responsibility in our communities, we wouldn't be so avid for these accounts of crime, and the newspapers would follow the moral feeling of the community. They don't make it.
Is it the case then that on each of these individual aspects of the problem we know what ought to be done, but when we take the problem as a whole, this calls for a change in our total culture so that we don't quite know how to approach it?
Yes, we really know all the factors in city life that expose large numbers of children to behavior we call delinquent. We know what they are.
Yes.
But we lack the ability to mobilize citizenship, responsibility for the whole country. I think the problem of how we're to take more responsibility as our societies get bigger and more intricate, instead of retiring into private life, trying to build little enclaves around ourselves and our children and taking less responsibility, which is the present trend, is at least a problem that calls for the next invention, next great invention.
The next great invention. Yes, certainly this is what we need. An invention to reduce the incidence of crime and delinquency in our urban society. But it will be a curious kind of invention if it comes, for it won't show us how to do these things. For the most part, we know what we need to do. Instead, it will show us how to care enough, how to be concerned enough to do those things that we already know ought to be done. Remember Margaret Mead's words, we consent to delinquency. Dr. Beck's point was equally well taken. The disturbing thing about this matter is not the number of children involved. It's not that all our children are going to the dogs, or watch out, your child too might become a delinquent. The point is that it's a sign. It's like a crack on a plaster wall. The wall is still intact, but if we don't pay attention to it, it might mean that the whole wall is coming down. Here in America, we've sold ourselves on the idea of preventive medicine right across the board. We haven't sold ourselves on the idea of the prevention of delinquency. If the problem is going to have to reach epidemic proportions before we wake up to it, we may not have long to wait.
This is National Educational Television.